The International Human Rights Treaty and many other organizations are intended to prevent actions that are considered inhumane. So today I will be talking about the death penalty and why it's wrong and why it's the worst punishment for criminals. I have done numerous amounts of research regarding this topic so I can present you with credible graphs and information to support my specific purpose. This topic is important because these acts of injustice are inhumane and affects more specific groups than affecting the others. Specifically, I will be talking about how the death penalty includes mostly mentally unstable people, how it can't be undone once it is done, and how it is used for control rather than justice. As we know, there are a lot of things that affect us. There are environmental and social aspects that have an influence on our behavior. Experts suggest that being able to flatten the curve of murder rate, we need to address the environmental and social factors that contribute to violent acts of crime. The majority of people who are on death row come from very poor and impoverished areas, and this can lead to high mental problems. So the Mental Health America, the MHA, estimates that 5 to 10% of all death row inmates severe from mental illness. And on the left-hand side, we have a graph that distinguishes severe mental illnesses and any mental illnesses. And as you can see, 20% of the inmates that were executed had personality disorder, and 13% had depression. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, 39.7% of executed inmates were abused during their childhood. And as you can see to the right, this is the graph that represents the childhood trauma that executed inmates were receiving and had in the past. Moving on to how once it's done, it can't be undone. So you can't take anything back. Once they find new evidence supporting your case, supporting that you're innocent, they can't do anything because you've been executed. This obviously is an error in the US government, and this error is rising to this day. The rate of error is rising. Prisoners are dying for being innocent, which is very wrong. So this is a famous case. Carlos de Luna, he was wrongfully accused of murdering a store clerk in Corpus Christi, and this is Carlos Hernandez, the actual person who murdered the store clerk, but nobody knew that. Nobody found out until Carlos de Luna, was executed. Years later, they found out that Carlos Hernandez, was actually the one who did it. In court, Carlos de Luna said that this man who did the murder was very violent, dangerous, and was well known to the law enforcement in Texas. And even saying that the prosecutors ridiculed that as a phantom of his imagination. But like I said, years later, they found out that it was Carlos Hernandez. As you can tell just by looking at these two put together side by side, it was really hard for them to tell who was who, especially their families. They couldn't pick out their own sibling. So next, as we think of the death penalty, we think of it as a punishment around the world, the death penalty really applies to any crime. This can mean adultery. You can commit adultery, burglary, drug-related offenses. You may get the death penalty. When doing research, I noticed that there was a lot of injustice, and it was mostly, they were mostly suppressing the inmates. They were suppressing them, and they were taking control of everything. They weren't really looking forward into maybe let's give them life without parole. Not even that. So allowing the death penalty to exist allows the government what's best for their own needs and their own purposes. And in this graph, it says the exonerations from death row. So this graph basically tells you, it shows you how many inmates that were on death row, how many of them were set free because they found more evidence to support their case, to support them being innocent. So I have made many statements regarding my specific purpose as to why the death penalty is wrong and why it's why we know a lot of our behavior is reflecting our environmental and social aspects. So if you take this aspect into consideration with the death penalty victims, this can change a lot of perspectives. And let's remember mental illness. Mental illness played a big role in the executed inmates and the inmates who are on death row today. So before executing, let's take a look at their medical history. A lot of them were in the right state of mind when doing this horrendous crime. They were in another world because of their severe mental illness. Like I showed you, there was 20% of inmates who had personality disorder and depression and a lot more mental illnesses. Lastly, justice is always overlooked. It's always overlooked, and especially in these kinds of situations, obviously there's less justice and more control. So at the end of the day, there's never more of an inhumane way of killing someone than the death penalty. It's embarrassing for them. It's embarrassing for the U.S. to look at it. It's embarrassing and can't be taken back once it's done.